In today's video, I want to talk about Vulcan's smart form modules, used to generate and display and submit forms. Now, first, I'll talk about, well, what smart form does and how to use it. And then in the second part, we'll get a bit more technical and talk about how things work behind the scenes. So what you're seeing here is Vulcan's forms example, which showcases all the various stuff you can do with SmartForm. And it's actually not using SmartForm directly, but instead using the data table component, which itself includes form for new documents and editing existing documents. Now, when you talk about editing a document, for example, there's actually, well, I guess 4 steps to it. Step 1 is preloading the data, in this case the documents data, right, the content of the fields. Maybe you'll also want to preload some extra data to serve as the options for a form field. Step 2 would be generating the actual form itself, so laying out the components, whether these are normal inputs, a custom component, maybe a date picker. Step 3 is actually submitting the form and seeing if there are any errors, all that interaction with the server. And finally, step 4 is getting the return value from the server. In other words, the result of the form submission. Usually that will be the updated document. So what's really cool about SmartForm is it handles all these steps for you in a pretty easy way. All you need to do really is specify a collection for a new document form or a collection and a document ID to edit a document. Now, if you look at the documentation, there's some more information about the other props you can pass to a form. For example, if we look at our example code here, I'm passing a pre-filled props property to the data table, which will be transmitted to the form just to set a default date, a success callback to show a small confirmation message, and so on. But really, you'll need much more than a collection and a document to get started, or document ID. One other thing I guess I should mention, which is often pretty handy, is where is this? So data table, the mutation fragment or mutation fragment name option. And like I said, the form will return a value from the server, right? It will, rather the server will return the result of the mutation of inserting or editing a document. And you want to make sure that you control what that return value looks like to make sure it fits in with the rest of your data. So in this case, the table already has a fragment that controls what data it loads, and that same fragment is used to tell the server the shape of the data to return after a form item is submitted. So just to keep everything consistent. Other properties, whether to show a delete document link, callbacks, of course, so that the fragments. But today I also mostly want to talk about how to control forms from the schema. So I just want to differentiate between the props you see here, which control the form itself, and then the props or properties we have on the schema, which control the form fields. And usually that's where the action happens. So let's go back to our code and look at our schema here. In this case, we are building a simple CRM type app where you have customers, and they have, a name. Stage is like their conversion stage from lead to prospect to customer. Meeting date, what date you're meeting them at or something. Product ID, what product they're interested in, and then addresses for their addresses. So far, so good. So as you can see, there's lots of different properties here, and let's go quickly through each of them. At the top of the file here, schema.js, we have an address group object, and that's going to be used to create this separate group for addresses. So in this case, this group only includes one field, but you can add as many fields as you want, and you can add as many groups as you want in your form as well. It's just a handy way to keep things nicely laid out. Second thing we have is the schema for the addresses field. And that's because it's actually a nested field with its own schema, right? As you can see, you can create, multiple addresses, delete them, and that works through these nested schemas. So keep this in mind, and when we scroll down here, you can see that we're using this schema as the type for addresses dot $. So what this means actually is we define two fields, or we have two definitions for the same fields. That's another way to look at it. Addresses is the main field of type array, but then we define the type of the contents of the array, right? You can think, this is kind of doing something like this, right, in GraphQL, except this here is using a simple schema, JavaScript schema, and that's the syntax or pattern they use. So you define two fields, the main array field, and then one for the contents of the array. In this case, all we need to do is specify the type, which again is defined here. So 3 fields, street, country, zip code. You can see we are initializing it as a new simple schema object. We're not just passing a plain JavaScript object, because we need to make it a simple schema object for validation and other purposes. And then we get to the main customer schema. We have the usual ID created at user ID fields, a name, stage, meeting date. As you can see, stage has a special control property. I might change this to like component or something else. So if it's different when you watch the video, don't panic. I'm not a fan of the name control. It's kind of ambiguous. But what it stands for is the component that controls what the form field will look like. So in this case, if we go back to our field, you can see that the stage has this weird like 3 buttons thing. Obviously not a standard component like an input or a date. And it is actually a custom component made just for the occasion. So let's take a quick look. There's 2 main parts. There's an update function, and then there's the thing itself, the component. Funnel is an array with 3 items. We just iterate on it, show 3 buttons. And then, we need to show which button is highlighted, and we check the value for this. So if the value equals the current stage, we set this button style to primary, else default. And then the only tricky part is the onClick event. So what do we do when the button is clicked? We want to update the value, and we do this through the context and through update current values. So update current values is a function on the context of any form component that takes 2 things. It takes an object that has 2 things. Path. So the path can either be a form name, so it could be name, stage, meeting date, or for nested forms, it would be like addresses.0.street or addresses.0.1.street, and so on. So that's the path, and then the stage. Here is the value, right? And because it's update current values, you can actually update multiple values at the same time if you need to. So you could have a second path and a second value, and so on. You can also pass null to delete the element, or an empty string. Passing null is kind of a more formal way of deleting, and it means you don't want to just set it to empty string, but actually remove the field from your document. That can be useful for things like selects. On a normal select, you don't have a way to delete something, so we kind of work around this with this, which sets it to null. So that's for a custom form component, form funnel. Moving down, the next kind of interesting thing we have is this product ID field. So leaving aside resolve as, which controls how the field resolves on the client. In this case, because this is product ID and we want to show the actual product, or at least its name, we can resolve it to a field of type product. So you can learn more about that in the documentation as field level resolvers. But here what's interesting is these two query and options fields. And that's here, field specific data loading. And well, here you can say that you can see that we have a list of 4 options for product names. And the question you should ask yourself right now is, where are these names coming from? They could be hard-coded, but if we did that when we add a product, it wouldn't appear here. And so what we're doing here is actually having an extra GraphQL query just to get these product names from the server. In fact, if you open up your DevTools, filter GraphQL queries, and then let's reload to make sure there's nothing in the cache, and click Edit. I'm gonna inspect the query itself. Yep, you can see it asks for a single customer, which is the data we see here, but also for a list of products, which is how we get these 4 items. And then the response, customer single is here, and then products list is here as well. So it's a really handy way to load extra data used to populate your form. And you can load as many of these like extra queries as you need. Here's how it works. You specify the query, and then options will specify the options that we get here. It expects an array with value and label pairs. So we are mapping the result of this query, which gives us products with IDs and names, just over to object with value and label keys. So that's what we're doing, and that gives us our options prop, which then gets passed on to the select options right here. And if we move up a little bit, well, I guess we can see here, but we also have access to the data returned from the server, like internally. So anyway, that's for options and query, super useful. And then addresses, which we already covered. So this is a pretty good example of all the various things you can have in a smart form, how to use them, how they interact. But now let's talk about how smart form actually works behind the scenes. So if you're only interested in just using smart form for yourself, for your own needs, feel free to stop here. If you want to understand how things fit in, maybe submit a PR, improve something, the next part should be interesting to you. So actually, let me start from the front end here and just use my trusty DevTools to inspect all the components that we have here. So here's the model, model body, and then edit form. That's the main thing. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Yeah, edit form is just edit form is kind of a pre-made component that works with edit button. So we can, it's not actually that important. The real component starts here at form wrapper. So this is what gets called when you call smart form actually. So let's open the corresponding file in Vulcan. So what's going on here? So the form wrapper, its role is to preload the data, basically. That's mainly what it does. So if we start at the render here, you can see the render itself is pretty simple. Component equals this.form component. give it some props, and then return that. The key here is that this .form component is the complicated part. It's actually initialized here in the constructor. The reason why it's initialized here and not in the render is because we are wrapping it with higher order components, and the React docs have a note about not using HOCs inside the render method. The reason why is because render will, re-render, rerun, and HOCs typically you don't want them to rerun. It can lead to a lot of unpleasant stuff, and especially for forms, you don't want let's say the data, the form data, to change as people are typing. So you want to make sure this only runs once. So this .get component, first step is to figuring out the options for with document. We also want to figure out the options for with new, with edit, with remove. We have some loading code in there, and then we wrap the whole thing like a Christmas present. So we wrap the loader with document, with edit, with remove, or if this is a new document form, we wrap it with new, and then something called extra queries HOC. The reason why is because when you are building an edit document form, we already have with document, so we are using that to load data. If you need to preload data in a new document form, we don't have with document because there is no document, so we just have a little HOC just for this extra data. And that's what we are building here. But the result is the same. In both cases, you end up with all these wrapped components. I think I lost my place. Let me get back to the DevTools. Okay, form. Okay, so you can see form wrapper actually will take form and wrap it with loader, with remove, with edit, with document, and it will make sure it configures each of these HOCs with the proper options. And then once that's all said and done, it returns the component which will get rendered. Of course, there's a lot going on. We are figuring out, what fragments to use, and maybe in some cases there are no fragments specified, so we generate some. But overall, yeah, this is all about data loading. Now, like I said, the second one in that step, in that cascade, is form. And form is the one that actually does the heavy lifting of generating the form fields. So that's why it's so long. There's a lot here, but again, let's start with the render method. So you can see we're assembling the different parts of the form. So the wrapper, the errors, submit button, and then the groups. The groups are the main part of the form. Now, even fields that aren't in a group are actually in the default group. So that's why we have this iteration over field groups. And it all starts with the get field groups method. First, we get field names. So essentially, we get the names of all the fields that are relevant to the current form, depending whether it's an edit form, an insert form, like a new document form, whether fields are hidden, whether there's a fields option specified for the form. All that is taken into account, and then we get just an array of field names. Now, where was I? Yeah. Once we have that array of field names, we iterate over it, and then for each field name, we actually create the field. In other words, we take the field name and then build this whole field object. If you want to see what that looks like, let's take, well, let's call, let's call get field groups. So there's two groups, default group, fields, 4 fields, and you can see for each field all the different properties it has. Some are specific to the field, some are actually repeated, like document. It's actually the only one, so we can probably in the future remove it, but you get the idea. Like, this is all the props that will actually govern how the fields are displayed. Now, a few things are not inside this fields object. The value of the field and the errors are not in there. The reason why is because, well, when you have, you know, nested fields like this one, well, you end up having lots of different values, right, for the same field. Like addresses has 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on values. So I didn't want to just multiply this by 4 and then repeat the same labels 4 times. So what I'm trying to say is that this field groups object, it kind of follows the structure of the field of the form, itself, but only so far as non-nested fields. When nesting starts, it only has like the generic structure. It doesn't have all the different levels of nesting. So this means that values and errors and all the things that, in other words, are like stateful, right, are stored separately. So there's kind of a nice separation between stateless data that controls how the form always looks, like whenever you load up that specific form, and then stateful data that can change. But anyway, getting back to our create field method, we are, you know, getting a label, options, form. Mostly we get all of this from the schema. In some cases, you know, if something is specified as a function, we call that function. And then if we have a nested schema, then we call this recursively and just build our whole field tree like this. In this case, you know, we have subfields here, and then control nested and so on. Now, let's go back here and keep moving down the path. We have form group. Fairly simple. You know, let's put this aside for now. These are just like SVG icons, so you know it looks like there's a lot of code, but actually the relevant code is pretty short. We have a heading, some logic to collapse, expand the group, and then basically we're just iterating over the fields and calling form component for each field. And form component, this is the other big piece of the puzzle. This is what's used to figure out what actual component should be displayed. In other words, whether it's number, URL, email, text area, select, date, or something custom. So this is the stage where we also figure out the value of the form field. There's a little bit of logic here. Basically, we are first checking if the document has a value. So for document edit form, you know, well, if this has a name, we want to show it. But maybe the value has changed, right? So, you know, if I do this, the value has changed. I'm not changing the original document. I'm not changing that original document property, right? Because this one is immutable, and also it would be a mess just to mix everything together. So instead, I'm changing this current values object here. And so you look at these two, like the document value, the current value, and then I try to figure out the best one to use. Because we handle nested objects, we sometimes need to merge instead of only like, you know, using one or the other. But that's the gist of it. That's the general idea. We get the value here. We also get the errors. So again, we look at the, you know, errors object on the form state. And by the way, all these current values, errors, deleted values, they are all on the state of the form component, and then passed down as props to all the different form components. But yeah, the idea is, you know, I was talking about stateless, stateful before. Form component only receives stateless props, and then value, errors, all the other stateful things, it figures out on its own and then passes down to It's well, the actual component that displays the input, whether it's the default or date or select. Finally, let's talk a little bit about how nesting works. If SmartForm detects that this is a nested form, it will set the form control to nested so that we use the form nested component. Form nested has two components in its file, form nested and then form nested item. Here we iterate over the value this time. So if the if addresses has 4 items, we'll show 4 form nested item components. And then we just call form component again, right? Because we already know how to display a component. So street, country, zip code, these are all just form component. Again, this is why we have the the data, the character count already built in. We can just reuse the exact same logic we used to display these little components. So the whole idea is you do have that nesting layer, but once you figure out what to display, you can kind of reuse the same logic as before. And it works pretty well, specifically because we are updating the path here, and because form component uses this path to update, or is it handle change here? Yeah, we're using the path. So if I pick a nested form component here, you can see its path is set properly to addresses0.street, addresses.0.zip code, and so on. So that's how nesting works, and that's how SmartForm works generally. So there's a lot of code, but the concepts are not that complex. The main difficulty is just understanding where each thing happens, and understanding what happens kind of at in that big like field groups object, and what's kind of separate from that. But in doubt, like the dev tools are super useful. Just inspect the state of the form component if you can find it, and that will generally tell you a lot about what's going on. I have an address autofill values, which actually doesn't currently work in the code I just showed, so the code might change a little bit to accommodate that, but basically it lets you pre-fill or autofill one field based on another. So it's useful if this was a URL field and you wanted to pre-fill like some other stuff based on that. By making an API call, you could do that through autofill values. So that's about it. That's SmartForm in a nutshell. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you have any thoughts on how to improve it. But hopefully this is a good first step on understanding how Vulcan forms work. Thanks.